Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Howard here with another edition of Those Were the Days Extended. And today we're going to take a little trip down memory lane and do some exploring of one of my favorite characters that I feel that Days has had over the past, maybe 20 years now. And that, of course, is the character of Nick Fallon. And specifically, we are going to take you back here. You'll see the picture here. You already know where it's going. I'm taking you back to May 12th, 2014, when Nick Fallon was murdered, where he stumbled to the Hortontown Square and died in his cousin Julie Williams' arms here. Of course, those of you who were watching back then know that Gabby was actually the killer of Nick. They had a little bit of a sordid history here. And you know what? This got me. I saw this sort of come up, and it just kind of got me thinking about the character of Nick in his different iterations that he's had over the years and how much the character has drastically changed. And yeah, just kind of wanted to take a walk down memory lane for that. And yeah, kind of explore Nick. He's was a very interesting, complicated character, I think, portrayed by an incredible actor, Blake Barris. And I think that I'll share some a little behind the scenes. I think they sort of made a mistake, or that they regretted sort of this decision to not just take him dark, but eventually kill him in this way. I think it made for great storyline and it set up a lot of things. But I think they also maybe regretted sort of losing a talent such as Blake Barris. And we'll get into that a little later. But yeah, just want to start it off with that memory. We'll take a little, again, trip down memory lane about the character of Nick. Starting off, he came to Salem back in 2006. And if you remember, he's the son of, if you don't know, he's the son of Jessica and Joshua Fallon. So he is a Horton by way of Jessica. Jessica, of course, is Marie Horton's daughter, therefore making Nick Marie Horton's grandson. That is why he is a Horton. And again, we saw Marie a few months ago for Doug's funeral. We hadn't seen her in years, but she came back for that. So yeah, if you always wonder how Nick is a Horton and why his last name is Fallon, that's why he is Marie Horton's grandson, and he is the son of Jessica Fallon. So yeah, that's how that worked out. And I am gonna take you back to this very young picture of Mr. Blake Barris as Nick Fallon during the days of what we used to call them Chick. And this, of course, is him with Rachel Melvin. And this is sort of the coupledom that started when he joined the show. Yeah, he sort of joined as this, you remember back then, this very awkward, this very shy, very intelligent, very astute, but very, again, awkward, shy sort of nerd here. And then he kept sort of running into Rachel Melvin's bad girl, who was Chelsea Brady at the time, and sort of a little new on the scene. This is not too far after Chelsea Benson was revealed to be Georgia, who in turn was Bo and Billy's daughter, later, of course, named from Chelsea Benson to Chelsea Brady. And I think they just wanted to incorporate her more into the show, and how else but give her a love interest. So enter sort of Nick Fallon, aka Nick Horton, into the scene. And again, it was very much an opposite attract. Like I said, Nick was the shy, very awkward sort of nerd at the time, and Chelsea she was a little, not, I wouldn't say a bad girl, but she was a little bit of a troublemaker. She was best friends with Abigail. That's how she came on the scene and how we first originally met her. But she was a little bit of a troublemaker, and so I think this was a way to get her to sort of turn over a new leaf. She's in this sort of new family with Bo and Billy as her new parents, because her adoptive parents died in a car crash, and she's sort of getting her bearings and who she's supposed to be. And she's living with Billy at this point and starting anew. And then in comes, this weird sort of awkward guy who she keeps just sort of bumping into and also bumping heads with, and very much not her type at first. And the same for him. I think Nick was very enchanted by Chelsea, but also had no idea what the hell to do with her or someone like her with her strong personality. So, but it kind of worked, and I think it was cute at the time. If you remember they had what I consider a pretty good following. I think people were rooting for them. Is very much opposite to track. And at the end of the day, behind sort of the tough exterior, Chelsea was really a sweetheart, and I think she eventually sort of fell for Nick. There was a little bit of a slow burn here, and one of the complications in their relationship was, if you remember, was that Nick had this drunken one night stand and he ended up sleeping with Billy Reed, of course, who was Chelsea's mom. That was a little bit of like their first real obstacle to get over outside of like meeting and sort of being opposites and navigating that. That was their first sort of big hurdle. But they eventually did go on to date for a little while. I want to say they dated for roughly 6, maybe like a year, if so, with that. It was a nice relationship. I think there was at some point there was this idea that that we should sort of break them up and have them go their separate ways. I think they had um, bigger ideas for both of these actors, but not together as a couple, not together as quote unquote chick. So I think there was this idea that while they were this sort of cute couple, um, they can do more with their characters if they're not together. So what we saw was that Chelsea was starting to develop feelings for other people, and they were just not getting along. And then what happened is they sort of took this opportunity to really take Nick in a completely different direction. And I'm curious, I was trying to find some behind the scenes on it and I really couldn't. So I'm curious to know if Blake Barris has talked about this. They wanted to make such a drastic change. And I don't know if it's because they felt they may have painted themselves in a corner with introducing him as this sort of shy, awkward nerd. I don't know if they were trying to harken back to his family history. You know, there's mental illness in the Horton family. We saw it with Laura and Jennifer at some points. And then if you remember back then, Jessica Fallon, Nick's mom, also suffered and dealt with multiple personality disorders. So I don't know if they were sort of hinting that. They never exactly made a clear connection between sort of the family's mental health issues and what Nick would eventually go through over the next couple iterations, which we'll get into. But that sort of forced us, after they dated for a while, of course, it didn't work out. They sort of broke them up and they sent them on sort of two different paths. And this first path they did with Nick is during this time too, I want to mention that they were that generation's version of the teen scene. It was Chelsea and Abigail and Stephanie was new on the scene there. And then it was like I said, Max and Nick. So it was those sort of five were the teen scene of their generation. And then Nick, of course, was good friends with both Max and Stephanie. And of course, dating Chelsea and also related to Abigail. So he definitely was integrated, especially with the younger cast there. But yeah, like I said, this is where this next iteration, when they decide to break Chelsea and Nick up and send them on two different directions, this is where things get a little hairy and we see a little bit of a changing of the characterization of the character Nick. And it started, let me go here, when we had Nick, of course, good friends with Max Brady. And then we have, here is Melanie, who we now know and now call Melanie Jonas. Melanie at the time, she sort of enters the picture. And what was going on at this time is that after breaking up with Chelsea, Nick sort of wanted to get his life together. He took this job as an associate professor under this physics professor named Trent Robbins. Well, it turns out Trent was the abusive biological father of Max Brady. Remember, Max Brady was adopted by Caroline and John Brady when he was younger with Frankie. But he has biological parents out there, and Trent was his biological father. He was abusive. Max was sort of very uneasy about him. He was good friends with Nick at the time. Nick was encouraging Max to go back to school because he saw that he was very smart and he had an aptitude for physics and science and things like that. And whenever Max or Nick would put Max in the same room or in a situation or talk about Trent, Max would get very nervous and uncomfortable. And again, we found out the reason why is because Trent was Max's biological father. Not only that, but he was also abusive to him when he was very young, causing him to run away. That's how he got with the Bradys years later. But during this time, we find out that Trent actually has another child, a daughter named Melanie, who he was unfortunately sort of using and pimping out as a sex worker to help him pay for like this gambling addiction that he had. So the stage is set that this guy is trouble. Not only was he abusive to Max when he was young, he sort of has not learned from his ways. He's also mistreating his now daughter named Melanie, who again is not introduced on the scene, but they find out that Max has a daughter, and sort of they between Max, Stephanie, and Nick, they sort of set out on this sort of race to find this girl Melanie and sort of um kind of bring her into the fold slash protect her slash Max just wants to meet her and he has another sibling out there, a biological, or so we thought, biological sibling at the time. um Happens is they find Melanie, they bring her back into the fold. They find out what Trent's been doing to her. Nick sort of steps in and saves Melanie, sort of develops these feelings for her that are they slowly seem sweet and nice. Like Nick is sort of like the knight in shining armor, but what they turn into is sort of obsessive thoughts and feelings towards Melanie in this sense of ownership and I must protect her, and it turns into this weird sort of stalking relationship. And this is we'll see this relationship develop in not only this relationship, excuse me, we'll see these qualities not only develop here with the Melanie relationship, but we'll also see them when we fast forward in a few minutes. We talk about his eventual relationship he has with Gabby and what leads to sort of his untimely death. So this is the genesis of it. This is the beginning of it. We see this obsessive nature, him taking on with Melanie first. Again, he saves Melanie from Trent, or saves Melanie from a dangerous situation. He brings her back to Salem. They're all there. Trent is sort of under the guise of, he's abusive now towards Melanie, as we see. Nick basically kills Trent in a fit of rage because he was almost going to hurt Melanie. Melanie blacks out. Nick comes on the scene. He kills Trent, sort of rushes off and leaves to hide and run away. Melanie wakes up and thinks that she did it. There's this sort of back and forth with, is she the killer? She thinks she's the killer. She also starts to get these messages from someone saying, sort of gaslights Melanie into believing that she did it. And what we find out, again, here's the obsessive nature coming around in a different sense, is that it was Nick who was sending her the messages. The reason why he was doing that was so that to make Melanie scared and fearful enough that she clung to Nick more as her protector and as a person that she could trust. And he used that sort of relationship to sort of manipulate her into trying to get her to marry him under the guise of, if we're married, I can't testify against you. I'm going to protect you. Don't worry, that sort of a thing. Again, if you've been watching since the beginning when they introduced this character, it was a very swift little sort of 180. But I think what made them sell it is the fact that Blake Barris is such a talented actor that you sort of went along with it in this, this sort of transformation from 2 years earlier, or maybe at this point, maybe 3 years earlier, he's the incredibly shy, awkward nerd who wouldn't hurt a fly. Now he's, committed murder and he's getting into fights with people and his personality is changing. And now he's become the obsessive stalker type who's manipulating this young woman into trusting him and sort of tricking her into marriage. Which is, again, very weird, very strange. But again, Blake Barris sold it. Eventually, Melanie remembers the truth. She remembers that she didn't kill Trent. She sort of realizes that Nick is up to something. She sort of gets him to confess, and then Nick is sort of sentenced to 18 months in prison. So people remember Nick's prison stay. It was because of the murder for Trent, even though it was in somewhat of an act of self-defense. He's sentenced to about 18 months in prison. And then, Melanie sort of moves on from there. Then this is where things get really complicated. And I think they sort of delve into the idea of not Nick being well, I call it Nick's villain error. He wasn't a full-on villain. They gave him a lot of nuance during this period, but this is now the period where he gets out of jail. And what happens is he's up for parole. Melanie feeling not responsible for what happened to Nick, but also I think she felt a lot of sympathy towards him because he was a good guy, and it was like he was sort of just going through a rough patch, and he just needed some help. She actually goes to the parole board, speaks on Nick's defense, helps get him paroled early. He comes out. She eventually sort of leaves town from there. So now we're sort of Nick back in Salem. I think he's staying at Julie's. He starts dating Gabby in this interesting sort of twist of fate, which is nice. It starts showing this weird aggression towards Will and Sonny. And again, these were the initial hints that something is a little off with Nick now. He's not, again, he had these issues, and yes, he killed Trent and committed murder, but I think people still saw the good in him at this point and thought he was just a little messed up. He's gone off the rails. Let's get him back on track, and all will be well. Nick's coming home. He'll be the old Nick. And then when he shows up, he starts dating Gabby, which I think some of us saw and was like, oh, this is an interesting direction they're going to take. They're going to put him with Gabby. Cool. At this point, Gabby is pregnant with Will's baby. Of course, they're still keeping it a secret. Will and Sonny are sort of together, and they're trying to figure things out. And again, Nick is showing this Nick is showing this really weird aggression towards Will and Sonny, who at that point, before he went to jail, he had a really good relationship with Will as his cousin. But yeah, so there's sort of that, and we see that is sort of the beginning hints that something isn't right with Nick here, that he is changed. Nick basically agrees to say that he wants to be the father of Gabby's baby because Gabby was keeping it a secret. They didn't want to say that Will was the dad, and it was just this big confusing storyline at the point of what is she going to do. At one point, I think there was the possibility of having an abortion that didn't happen, and so this all sort of coincided at one time. Nick agrees that he wants to marry Gabby and be the father of the baby. That way no one has to know it's Will's baby. And then unfortunately, and Will also sort of goes along with this. He's newly in a relationship with Sonny. He's just trying to figure out his feelings. They sort of all come together and think that this is the best thing for everyone, that Nick is in love with Gabby. He's going to marry her, and that he'll take on the role of dad to this new baby. And, the baby will be in the family and all will be good. Again, we're starting see those obsessive thoughts and qualities with Nick come along. And then Nick gets fearful that Will is going to change his mind. So he basically blackmails Will with the info. He basically finds out that Will is the one who shot EJ in the head, and that Lucas, of course, took the blame for it. If you remember that storyline, Nick figures that out and uses it to sort of try and get Will out of the baby's life, and the baby and Gabby's life. During that time, we also get a little insight into why Nick is so he's so cold. He's sort of weird about Sonny and Will. We find out that Nick was essentially sexually assaulted and raped in prison. And that is why he has this sort of skewed idea of two men together. It sort of breeds this homophobia in him that wasn't there before, that didn't exist. And really, it's sort of this exploration of the trauma he faced with being sexually assaulted and not getting the help. And sort of he's projecting that now onto Sonny and Will, who are two men who are together, who of course have absolutely nothing to do with the sexual assault or anything to do with harming everyone, but in his mind, he equates it to that. So there was this weird sort of like commentary at the time, and I think the powers that be were really trying to do something interesting here, especially sort of dealing with and talking about trauma from a man in his perspective of sexual assault, which I applaud them for. I think there was so much going on at that time. It was hard for them to really explore that like they should have. Like, I think if they did that storyline now, I think it would be so it'll be a lot more interesting and a lot more in depth than they did at the time. I think before they kind of they didn't shoehorn it in. We definitely saw the progression of it, but I think it would have been handled a little bit differently and it would have been explored a little bit more. But yeah, but that's that's sort of how it was going at the time, and so we got that sort of insight into Nick and why this was happening to him. At the time, his obsession with Gabby is growing strong. He's getting weirder around her. He sort of wants to take her and Ari away from Sonny and Will, and still wants to be the dad. And he's, according to him, he's trying to do the right thing. Again, it's that knight in shining armor complex that he has. It's the obsessive traits he's getting. It's also the homophobia mixed in. It's all the above to sort of make Nick be this new character that we're not that familiar with. And what happens is it sparks this storyline that I think came out really well and is sort of, I hesitate to say a fun one, but I think it's one that everyone sort of really enjoyed. And if you remember at the time, it was, I'll sort of nickname it sort of the Bad Girls Club here. And this is where we got the team up of Kate, Gabby, and Sammy when they team up to basically kill Nick. If you don't remember that, he was sort of, again, getting obsessive with Gabby. She's sort of backing off at this time and realizing and recognizing who he is and is like, I don't want a part of this. You're scaring me now. He follows her into the woods. She trips and falls down. There's this weird attempt at like a sexual assault. Gabby comes to. She hits Nick over the head with a rock. Kate is following him. Kate sort of sees them arguing first, follows them into the woods, and is sort of there at Gabby's side. She immediately calls Sammy to get in the mix, and they deduce that Nick is dead. Of course, we later know he's not, but they think he's dead at this point. So they decide the best thing to do is not to call the police or get sort of or call the police and tell them what happened and claim self-defense. They decide that they are going to get rid of Nick in the process, who has been at this point has been causing issues for all three of these women. So it was like, you know what, let's kill three birds with one stone, so to speak. So they decide to throw him in the river. And this storyline, again, it's a little morbid in the sense of getting rid of Nick, but I think it was great to see these three women come together. I think at this point, this was the little bit of the beginning of the softening of the Kate and Sammy relationship, which they then would go on to actually become friends later on during this period of time. But it's also putting Gabby in their mix. And I think the Gabby that we see in this picture is she's not the Gabby we know today yet, but she's in the process of getting there. And I think this was sort of her introduction into being sort of the complicated, little bit more of a gray character Gabby that we have now, who's sort of capable of things more so than the innocent teen who we were sort of first introduced to. So yeah, this is sort of like I say like her coronation into the group, or like her invitation into the Bad Girls Club of Kate and Sammy on the show. And I think it worked out well. It was a wonderful team up that we enjoyed. Of course, Nick, of course, was not dead. He later came back into the mix and tried to sort of blackmail all these women again and try and get Gabby on her side. And that's what eventually led to Gabby sort of snapping and killing Nick in cold blood, because she had just had it at this point. This is now almost a year and a half of storyline of going back and forth with this guy. And it was also, part of it is her own guilt too, of everything that happened with Nick. She allowed him to interfere in her relationships with Will and Sonny. She sort of allowed the wolf, into the house, so to speak. And so there was a lot of guilt associated there. And that is, of course, which led to Gabby herself going to prison for Nick. It also is what set up the Julie and Gabby rivalry that still exists to this day. It's cooled a little bit at certain times, but it is very much still alive. And all that stems from the fact that Gabby killed Nick in cold blood here. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about, before we wrap up here, just like I said, it was an interesting storyline. It was an interesting sort of start to finish with this character over the years, from when he came on to 2006 until not only that picture of him dying which happened in 2014. So we got about 8 years of the character. There was a lot of ups and downs. There was a lot of changing. I think he's a character who progressed and has changed more so than any other character we've seen on the screen. And like I said, I think the writers were trying to give Blake Barris something interesting and complicated to do and deal with as far as storyline. I think they went a little bit too far with killing the character. Maybe they felt like they painted him into a corner and this is the only way they can get out of it is to kill the character. But it feels like after that, whenever they had an opportunity to bring him back, they did. If you remember, they brought him back once during one of the Halloween episodes as a ghost to wreak havoc on Gabby a few years ago. Then, of course, they brought him back during the Kate, Marlena, Kayla sort of heaven storyline. And when he came back then, I think they tried to play upon the evilness of him, but I also think they gave him some nuance there with him having regret for some of the things he did. He also sort of alluded and hinted to the trauma of the sexual assault, and that's why, you know, he was messed up at the time. So, and I think I have to say this, I can't find any confirmation fully, but I think that was the genesis for then bringing him back as a different character, bringing him back as Bobby / Everett a few years ago. And yeah, I think unceremoniously that it happened to him again. He was sort of caught in you know the unfortunateness of the strike that happened. But I think Blake Barris is such a world-class talent. I think there's so much more for him to do. I think the Bobby Everett stuff was so cut short, but you know what? I'd say I wouldn't be surprised if there was at least the idea that they wanted to bring him back as Nick at some point. I don't know how they would do that, but or maybe bring him back as another character. I'm not sure. I just think Blake Barris is such a great talent that I think a lot of this stuff has been about a little bit of course correction with getting rid of him when maybe they shouldn't have. And yeah, I'd like to see a little bit more exploration of his character moving forward. But yeah, so yeah, that was a little sort of trip down memory lane into the many, many different facets of the character of Nick Fallon. He, if nothing else, whether you loved him, you hated him, liked him at certain points, he was definitely entertaining to watch. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see if we see Nick Fallon again in any time in the future. But thanks everyone. That was this week's Those Were Days, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Those were